Hey guys, y'all like my little intro? People say that I am the world's best teacher. And today I'm going to start with the PowerPoint. Y'all did awesome with your propaganda assignments, and I'm just going to discuss a little bit starting just at the very beginning, right there, discontent and experimentation. Just moving into the very next slide, weakness with the democracies. Lloyd George was the prime minister in England at the time, and he wanted a land that was fit for heroes, but unfortunately England is going to decline over the next 20 years. A lot of this is because of World War I. The economy is gonna suffer. Debt was 10 times more than it was in 1914, and part of that was what we discussed before we left school, was that Germany didn't pay back a lot of the money it owed. The need for coal had diminished, and many miners were laid off. And due to this unemployment, Great Britain was turning into almost like a unemployment state. Many were on the dole, which is government relief for those that are unemployed. So Britain was basically falling into a welfare state, and then you have Ramsay MacDonald, who becomes the first Labour Party Prime Minister of Britain. And continuing with Great Britain, many territories that were under them wanted their independence from Britain. That included Ireland, Egypt, India, and they were granted independence from Great Britain. And in 1931, something called the Statute of Westminster was passed, in which it set up a British Commonwealth of Nations that included Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa. And basically this Statute of Westminster said that all the people in these nations were equal to the British people. Some of them felt like they were kind of lesser than the British people, or their countries weren't treated the same, or maybe the British people themselves thought that they were better than people in these countries. So now this Statute of Westminster gives everybody equal rights. Moving on to France. France, after World War I, suffered more loss of life than Britain. Their economy did recover better than Britain's, maybe because they were on the mainland of Europe. So between the first two world wars, remember France shares a border with Germany, they had to deal with German aggression, they had frequent changes as prime ministers, and they had to deal with the rise of the socialist and communist parties. Basically, those parties would just set up groups in all areas of countries and trying to spread their words and spread their ideas. So some parties joined together and set up something called the Popular Front. And basically they gained control of the government. France had a new prime minister named Leon Blum. And of course they were still wary of Germany. They just didn't like sharing a border with Germany. Even a portion of the border. They did not have any guaranteed help from U.S. and Great Britain if Germany decided to attack. So they formed defensive alliances with countries on the other side of the German border. Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia. So basically those countries would help, would promise to come and help France if the Germans moved in on France, and France, which was a much stronger country, would do the same thing. So in 1929, France also decides to start building this line by Andre Maginot, it's still called the Maginot Line. It was 560 miles long. It was a line of fortification from the Swiss border to the Belgian border. That was all the area of Germany. And some of you don't have pictures. The Maginot Line was France's first line of defense. I know it's not easy to see France, you can see the border right there in the red. Germany, Belgium. Here's little Luxembourg right there. And basically, this was almost like small little underground cities. They were connected by trains, and they had power stations, ammunition supplies, but they also had like a little hospital, a place to educate. They had a movie theater, of course, kitchens. They had cars that they had put underground that they could move quickly from one place to another. It still is there today, certain sections of it that people are able to go and visit. Sorry. Now moving into the United States. So this is again after World War I. We've covered Great Britain a little bit, France a little bit, now the U.S. The U.S. was famous for their Roaring Twenties at this time. The U.S. wanted to remain isolated from world affairs. They wanted normalcy, and President Harding promised them that in his election, and President Coolidge continued with Harding's ideas. We have the Roaring Twenties, which meant new technology is going to lead to more mass production. Mass production means people are going to get new goods. They're going to get easier ways to do things. Just think like everyday things we have now. A microwave, washers and dryers. Some places, their freezers were still blocks of ice that would be delivered to them. So because people had new technology, they had more leisure time, and they had lots of time to spend money. And this was also when they had the rise of a lot of credit, like credit with more, like you think of Sears, Roebuck at that time, and department stores. Macy's, that department store. So there had always been kind of credit around, and somebody would say, go to the little country store where they lived, and they'd say, Mr. Riggs, put this milk on my account. And they'd pay their account at the end of the week or end of the month. However, they, worked it out with the owner. So at the end of the 1920s, we have the stock market collapse. This collapse triggered a drop in prices, lots of decline in foreign trade, many people lost jobs, banks failed, huge rise in unemployment, many factories closed as well. And one thing about the stock market is it just wasn't like something that was overnight. If you want to look up a chart of the stock market crash with the dates, it actually started, it had a peak in July of 29, and then it slowly kind of went down over the next few years till it bottomed out in July of 1932. So it lasted for a few years. It did have a short recovery in the mid 1930, but this was just 3 years of downhill. It finally started to rebound somewhat in 1933. So continuing on, the winter of 32 to 33, 13 to 17 million people were out of work, and that was 1/3 of the U.S. population at the time. Many Americans were lined up in bread and soup lines. That was all they could get. People would hold up signs saying, hire me, we'll work, we'll do this. Kids, they'd use kids with signs saying, will you please give my daddy a job? So part of that was America starts looking for a solution. It's at the end of Herbert Hoover's term. He gets most of the blame for the stock market crash, even though it really wasn't all his fault for that. And then that's when FDR gets elected. And FDR has all these promises. And some of his promises are nicknamed like the ABC soup because he comes up with so many things with letters. So his recovery is called the New Deal. It was relief, recovery, reform, subsidies for farmers, employment for young men, regulate the stock exchange, and in 1935 he actually set up the Social Security Act, which we still have Social Security today. This only provided temporary relief. There was no real recovery of our economy. Some of his policies weren't planned out very well. I mean, he was just throwing things out there. Some things still exist today, some don't. This is also when we have a rise of a bureaucracy in the United States when non elected officials handle government affairs. And this New Deal basically led to increased government involvement in economic and social matters. And it basically accelerated the U.S. towards a welfare state. So we have the U.S. heading in the same way as England. We have England getting ready to turn into a welfare state. And we only have France whose economy has recovered better, but then they always have to worry about the Germans at their borders. So some of the things he set up, and some of you don't have pictures, but these are a couple cartoons from them. Let me get back to it. So that's Uncle Sam right there. And you can see all the kind of things he's thrown into the pot together. And there's Uncle Sam, sorry. And you can see everything down there in the bottles. The CCC, the NRA, FACA, CWA. Like, that's why they kind of said it was almost like an alphabet soup. All right, moving on. I'm going to move down to the rise of totalitarian dictatorships. That's the one that has the picture of like the German man holding up two frail, sick people. All right, so sometimes Europeans look towards the wrong men to bring stability to their countries, and we are going to see that happen with Adolf Hitler. We're going to see it with Mussolini in Italy, and this is all during World War II. And these basically dictators would set up totalitarian states. They would use propaganda. They would use their secret police to arrest people, to even assassinate people. If anybody barely spoke out against them, they would be, killed or disappeared, things like that. I mean, that's relevant today with the COVID-19 and some of these doctors and people disappearing in China that are saying, well, maybe the government did know about it sooner and didn't do enough about it. So there are some mysterious things happening. They cared more about the state succeeding than the people, although they always made it look like they were caring about the people and their needs. And most of these totalitarian states had one party, and it was led by a dictator. And if you have the pictures, the little picture, again, is a German man holding up two sickly people. And it says, "You are sharing the load. A hereditarily ill person costs 50,000 Reichsmarks on average up to the age of 60. So basically it's saying, these sickly people are costing the healthy people money. So that's early propaganda kind of against their own people. So communism kind of moves into Russia. Well, we know that that's the stronghold of communism. And starting back in the 1880s, you still have a czar in Russia, Tsar Alexander II. After him came Alexander III, who attempted to suppress some of these revolutionary ideas and some of the people that maybe wanted to become more democratic. And he basically demanded strict censorship of the press. He persecuted minorities. Any minorities, he wanted them to be more Russian in their attitude, how they spoke, their religion. And he even set up pogroms, which were government massacres that killed thousands of Jews in Russia. So, I mean, he was fairly different than his father. You can see his father has a painting, and that's him in the picture right there. So this is also the time that you have the end of the czars in Russia. The next Alexander continues with his father's ideas, and this causes two groups to rise up in Russia, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks want to change through peaceful matters. The Bolsheviks wanted change through any way they could. Most of the time, it was through some form of violence. And basically, this is also when the Tsar and his family are killed. And we'll get to that in a few more slides. But, I mean, there is a picture on the slides of the room right there. There's him and his family. And his son, that'll be mentioned later. So a little bit about the prelude to revolution in Russia. There are three things that happened: the Russo-Japanese War, Bloody Sunday, and October Manifesto. With the Russo-Japanese War, Russia tried to expand into Japan, and Japan basically embarrassed Russia. They beat them badly, and Russia had to sign a treaty, and it was actually called the Treaty of Portsmouth with Japan. Then you have something called Bloody Sunday, in which Tsar Nicholas, it was a protest at Tsar Nicholas's Winter Palace. He wasn't even there at the time. The people didn't know that were outside. But, again, he wasn't there. They were kind of protesting inequality at work. It was men, women, and children. It was peaceful. And this is kind of when they find out that many Russians are no longer loyal to the Tsar. So then you have the October Manifesto in 1905, when you have peasant uprisings in factories. So now these kind of uprisings and protests are spreading from the cities out to the more rural areas. And to better organize themselves, they actually form a council. But, and here's where we get the word that has lasted with them, we get the word Soviet. Soviet means council. And Nicholas II basically gave in to this council. He issued the October Manifesto, which said he was going to set up a constitutional government with free speech, and a Duma, which was a national assembly to be elected by the people. It never really happens. He just did that to kind of appease the people that were protesting. So one thing about Bloody Sunday was, here's a picture from Bloody Sunday right there. Basically, and there's a picture too of the Tsar and president and Japanese leader at the time. Look at how they make the other two countries look kind of hunched over and pitiful. And then you have the president, Teddy Roosevelt, right there, nice and strong. But Bloody Sunday was when people were also massacred outside the Winter Palace. The troops were given the authority to fire on the people, and they fired on the men, women, and children, killing many from all three groups. And they really had never done anything to deserve to be fired upon. So with that, we're going to have the outbreak of revolution. War is going to break out due to the Tsar's policies, and poor planning is going to lead to heavy casualties. So actually, Tsar Nicholas goes to war himself to command the troops. While he was gone, the queen was kind of left in the care, or really influences, of this guy named Rasputin. And Rasputin had won favor with the princess and the queen because he healed her son of a blood disorder. This is a blood disorder that you can find today in lines of many royals in Europe. It's hemophilia. It's like a clotting disorder. And basically, you know, I've said it before in class how all these royals are related and have married in different countries and can trace their lines all back to each other. And so you can have people in Germany, France, Great Britain, Belgium, Denmark, the Netherlands. Those were some of the main countries that, you know, people would marry each other from and kids are going to show up with hemophilia through those lines. It's genetic. So he became an advisor. This guy Rasputin becomes an advisor to the family. He was corrupt and greedy, and many people didn't like him. And he ends up actually being murdered by some Russian nobles. And they thought this would help their country. Apparently, it took several tries to actually kill Rasputin. He did not go down easily. If you'd like to look that up later and see the different methods they employed to try and kill him. So part of this outbreak of revolution, again, you have the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, and in March 1917, so this is kind of like, Europe is involved in World War I. Remember, Russia signed a treaty taking themselves out of World War I. You have strikes and riots in Petersburg. Troops actually joined the people that were on strike at the time. It kind of just snowballed into many cities and many organized Soviets or councils. And the Duma was disbanded at this time. March 15th of that same year, 1917, Tsar Nicholas abdicates his throne, which means he gives up his throne. And the Menshevik leader, Alexander Kerensky, comes to power. He sets up a provisional government. Remember, Mensheviks wanted to do things through peace, and part of this provisional government was hoping to set up a more democratic government and not have this one leader or dictator. So, of course, the Bolsheviks want things to move faster, and they'll do it through violence. And they wanted immediate end to this revolution, which made Kerensky's job impossible. So what we've seen through history is, a lot of people don't want to wait to do it the right way, and then they pay for it later. This is what the Russian people did. They didn't want to wait for Kerensky to set everything up in the right way. They wanted something immediate, and they're going to end up paying for it in the form of communism, in the form of their country being backwards, behind, even to this day. So, starting with the slide, it says founding of USSR, Bolshevik seize revolution. So, in that time, you have the leader Vladimir Lenin. He was the Bolshevik leader. And, of course, they focused on more violent means of getting what they wanted. Of course, he was a very strong leader. He thought the power in the country should go to, only a small group of people. He was successful because many Russians didn't support the provisional government, and a lot of peasants and workers saw immediate help from Lenin and the Bolsheviks. The soldiers wanted an immediate end to fighting, and in 1917, 2 million soldiers had deserted the army. Many of the Russians at this time turned to the Bolsheviks and Lenin. The Bolsheviks end up seizing power, which is going to lead to a civil war in Russia. And that is where I'm going to stop today. And I will upload this today, Tuesday, and we have our Google Meets tomorrow. You don't have to watch it by the time we meet tomorrow, but you'll want to probably watch it by the time I load up a quiz for y'all. So anyway, see you later. Bye.